I would start by saying that the European project, the integration of Europe, has always been about reconciling identity with values. And what do I mean by that? I mean that nationalism, and a particularly vile, in my view, aspect of nationalism, nativism, which was something of the 19th century, is a denial of the essential values of universalism and integration, which many of us who believe in Europe believe it's fundamental rationale, moral rationale to lie in this. So what we are seeing at the moment is the re-emergence of nationalism, but of a type of nationalism which appears to be driven by a sense of ethnic distinction and difference, which is exactly what the European Union was created to avoid. Somebody once said that European integration was about the taming of nationalism. I believe that that's an accurate summary of the purpose of a noble idea which many of us in this room believe in. Somebody once said that the problem for one particular country, which I won't identify, but may be identifiable from the quotation, the problem the country had was reconciling a past that it could not forget with the future that it could not avoid. And that, in a sense, is the problem that we all have and that Europe was created to deal with. That's a long way around answering the question that you asked. The challenge which Europe now faces is potentially deeply destructive of European integration. It could actually destroy it, because it has raised again the devils of our past. It has recreated the concept of borders, not merely the borders that are obvious in terms of, the borders that are obvious in terms of physical borders, but the mental borders that are the result of a feeling of difference, of nationalism, of national identity, which is incompatible with my belief in the fundamental values of Europe, which are the equality of man and the dignity of man, which can't be interfered with by nationality. So then we see the re-emergence in Central and Eastern Europe and in other parts of Europe, day by day, of parties of the extreme right who express in unadulterated format an extreme nationalism which denies this fundamental equality of man value that Europe is all about. We're facing more than an economic challenge. We're facing a challenge to the identity of something which is noble and which has to be maintained. And having said all of that, we have to also be prepared to argue the issues, not merely on the basis of what I have just said, but on a pragmatic basis. And on a pragmatic basis, I find it impossible to understand how some politicians in Europe profess to be utterly committed to the internal market, and at the same time to be essential advocates of the recreation of borders. This is a contradiction in terms. So the internal market program and the creation, initially I think in 1985, of Schengen and its gradual development is about more than just economics. it's about breaking down borders. And now we have the anomalous situation of some politicians whose nationalism has become so strong that they're prepared to wreak economic difficulty as well as moral difficulty on their own societies and others by recreating borders. It doesn't even make sense. Borders don't work. Borders are proven to be porous. Even borders for countries which are surrounded by water. In my little country, there used to be a song with the refrain, "Thank God we're surrounded by water." You'll never guess why we thought that. But in any event, that mentality, the mentality that we're surrounded by water or fences or moats to keep people out, is destructive of everything that I believe in. And and it's the reason why I'm doing the job I'm doing, even though I'm losing my voice, I've been fighting so much. It's something we have to fight. And I think one very good ground for fighting it is on the pragmatic argument that is here. It was also the same, incidentally, when Pascal and Jacques Delors and myself, the Commission and others, ran the 1992 program. Mrs. Thatcher was faced with the issue. Are you for it? You say you want an internal market. If you want an internal market, we have to have majority voting. We have to accept the principle of the supremacy of European law. We have to accept that borders are no longer going to function as they did. And in the end, divided in her own mind, perhaps, by the challenge that she had posed for herself by advocating the internal market, it became largely a reality. It's not a complete reality. We've an energy market which is incomplete. We have banking union, which we're moving towards but haven't quite got to. There are other aspects, but we've achieved a lot. And now we have this incredible move, particularly inexplicable, from a group of countries in Central Europe and Eastern Europe who clamored for the freedom to move, who wanted to move, whose people were saved, the Hungarians in 1956, by one of the two cases of greatest opening to refugees. And what did these people challenge? I could have to stop talking because I go on forever. They challenged this. There are only three alternatives to refugees. Refugees are persecuted people. They're coming across the Mediterranean, and they're coming in very large numbers, and they will continue coming. But the three alternatives are you leave them on the beaches, or freezing in the rivers, or you send them home, or you went back to the persecution from which they're escaping, or you welcome them. What answer is there except to welcome them? What moral answer is there? There's none. And to think that we are refusing to do so and erecting borders in countries who complained that in the Iron Curtain days they couldn't move. They wanted to move, and they dug tunnels to move. To think that these people are the ones who resist and who say, as three prime ministers have said, we'll accept refugees as long as they're Christians. Well, it's a strange Christian who thinks that way. The simple answer to that is that some are and others aren't. I think that there has been leadership from Mrs. Merkel, which I think has been admirable throughout this crisis. I also agree with the positions going back to the 10th of May, I think it was, and subsequently, that have been taken by the Commission. And I think Jean-Claude Juncker has been leading and his team. I think they're continuing to try to lead. And I think there are a number of other countries in Europe who are also trying to lead. How, however, can we stand over a situation where countries like Italy and Greece take enormous numbers of migrants? Let's leave aside whether they're refugees or economic migrants, and that's something I'll come back to in a moment. They're human beings. They're either in camps, which I've seen, or alternatively, they are trying to escape up over the Alps or up through the Balkans. Sooner or later, the argumentation will be that they will have to be kept in some way that avoids this continuing challenge where they're blocked at the border by barbed wire. And then the Commission proposes that we should share the responsibility on the basis of objective criteria. Do we believe in solidarity? Do we believe in a European Union? Some member states do, but very many others don't. They simply refuse to share. On a broader scale, in the resettlement, you've 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. You've a quarter of the population of the Lebanon. They're living in camps. I've seen some of them too. How can we avoid the global responsibility of sharing at that challenge? Does proximity define responsibility? It can't. Second point, different point. Some of the political leaders say, okay, in principle, we accept that refugees, persecuted people, have to be given sanctuary. Some of them who say that don't give them sanctuary, but they say it because they can't deny it. But then they say, but all economic migrants are to be sent back. Who are all economic migrants? It's everybody except a refugee, apparently. Now, as 50% or more are women, children, in fact, it's more than 50%, they're all to be sent back. Are they to be sent back to where? Is Sudan a place where they can be or should be sent back to? Is where? It's an unacceptable argument. It's absolutely unacceptable. People are people. Now, I accept that you cannot argue for an open border policy in regard to migration. It couldn't get democratic consent. There has to be an acceptance of the principle that people who do not and should not be deserve to be kept in a society on humanitarian grounds should be sent back, or can be sent back. I think that is an inescapable pragmatic reality. But it has to be based on a European policy that is balanced, that allows for the fact that there are certain types of visas which should be discussed in Valletta, where certain types of movement and recurring movement, coming, working for a season, going back, not being excluded from coming back the following year, as a result of which people won't go home in the first place. Family reunions, people who have already integrated into the societies which they've come to, and we're going to have no means to accommodate them. And this at a time when the 10 countries in the world with the greatest challenge in 25 to 30 years' time in the relationship between retirees and the working population are the 10 countries in Europe who refuse to take migrants. Incidentally, Germany, which, as I've said, has been generous, it also has to be said that Germany has the lowest birth rate in the world. In the world. It could, and on strict economic grounds should, take a very significant number of migrants each year. And bear this in mind, of the Syrians who migrate, 40% of the Syrians in Greece, for an example, which is probably a representative group of all the Syrian migrants, have degrees. And 47% more have a full secondary education. 52%, as another example, of all the doctors in England are not British. I don't know what the figure is for nurses. I bet you it's far higher. And if you took Filipinos alone, that would be a significant proportion of them. What I think is admirable about this program, and Jacob Wallenberg in particular deserves great credit for pressing this particular project, is in this project we should be able to marry objective reality with the emotionalism of anti-migrant feeling, which is growing up. And there's plenty of evidence. And those more brilliant than me on this panel will be able, hopefully, to help us put it all together. But there's bucket loads of evidence as to why migration is a positive. I mean, we've already been hearing it in terms of the innovative nature, the courage, the involvement of migrants in society. And therefore, the internal market may seem a dry and economic issue, but it's a dry and economic issue that has immediate implications for this issue, which is driving us apart at the moment. And we have a brief moment in Europe, in my view, to rescue our integrity. And the brief moment that we have to rescue our integrity is now. Every generation has challenges. Most of us have had virtually none. We've been lucky to live in a time when there was, in relative terms, no challenges. Now we have a challenge. And the question is, if it is our destiny to face this challenge, how will history view us? If we allow the rejection of people who are clamoring from dreadful circumstances to join us, leave the moral side alone, but we also help to destroy the European project, which even on economic grounds is essential for our future and the future of our children. It's and in the end of the day, you say, well, what are you saying? What I'm saying is, where are the bloody leaders?
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. And that's what we need. We need leadership. And there are some, I've mentioned a couple, but there are many who are heading for the hills. And they look at the opinion polls, they don't like what they see, and then suddenly you get a transformation. And you wonder, I finish with this, you wonder how we got, following the dreadful photograph of a child on a beach, we got the following day, we got policy changes, fundamental policy changes in a couple of countries. Oh yes, suddenly they were saying, oh yes, we want to take, we want to do X, Y, and Z, having been denying it the previous day. And then a couple of weeks later, that's forgotten about, even though we know that there have been thousands and thousands drowning over the last 3 years, but their photograph wasn't on the front page of a newspaper. So the figures had no impact. The photograph had an impact. Photograph then went away, and we were left with a policy vacuum and what I think is an increasing tendency towards a negativism across Europe towards migrants. But I find it very difficult to answer that question. I think that the proposals that he has made, if I understand them correctly from my telephone, in the letter that was sent, depending on how they're advanced, in most instances would have a reasonably receptive audience in the Council of Ministers. The real issue is assuming that he comes back with an agreement on the basis of the proposals that he has put forward, but varied in some respects. Will this be acceptable to his own party? If it's not acceptable to his own party, there is a very substantial rump of his own party who will not accept it. Then we're in a situation where, going into a referendum, you have a major opposition party which is in somewhat of disarray at this moment. You have a government which is divided in its own supporters in Parliament. You have a rapidly Eurosceptic press in the majority. And you have a number of serious crises building one on top of another within the European Union itself. The migration issue, which rightly or wrongly is blamed on the European integration movement. The residual fallout of austerity, as it's described, and the Greek problem, and so on and so forth. So I think that the most one can say at this stage is that this is a deeply dangerous time in terms of the issue as to whether Britain, in the end of the day, will vote to stay in or leave. And in London, you get differing views. In my experience, the establishment view generally is, oh, it'll be all right on the night. Things will work out reasonably well, and there will be such an overwhelming argument on the economic grounds for staying in that people will ultimately accept that. And we will have a 1975 rerun, if you like. On the other hand, you can go to a conference, as I did 2 weeks ago, where the audience was asked, an intelligent audience, I should say, was asked what their view was, and not what they would like, but what their view of the outcome would be. And to my amazement, 80% said that they thought Britain would leave. So nobody knows. And the opinion polls are very close. They vary up and down over the last 6 months. So I've no idea. If Britain does leave, I think Europe will be impoverished by its leaving. It can't be said that Britain has been a comfortable partner since it joined. At every stage of every negotiation, it has railed against the increasing integration which many of us believe in. But maybe, in the case of the euro, the arguments that it was premature and ill-founded have a certain resonance, having regard to what has happened since. But if Britain were to leave, Europe would be impoverished by its leaving. It would not be good for Britain. In my view, it would be extremely bad for Britain and Britain's economy and influence in the world, but it wouldn't be good for the rest of Europe either. So we have to hope that the negotiation comes to a satisfactory conclusion, subject to the caveat for convinced Europeans like myself that there are certain bridges we will not cross. And if it comes to referendums in our own country, if those bridges are crossed, those referenda, I suppose should say, those referenda should not be taken for granted, because many of us also have principles at stake in this negotiation. So that's a very difficult question to answer.